and welcome to the MBSE Embassy. Today we'll be talking about communication, the common language. Communication is key to everything that we do in the world of MBSE. Just consider the many stakeholders that we have at all different levels. When we talk about communication, we need to communicate, for example, between different organisations, between different business units within individual organisations, between individuals that work for the organisations, and between systems. And just to add another layer of complexity, we can mix any or all of these. But given these levels of complexity in the world of communication, how do we avoid ambiguity, confusion, and misunderstanding? And that's going to be the topic of today's discussion. If you talk to anybody in the world of model-based systems engineering and say, how do we avoid these communication issues, the answer that usually comes up, which is absolutely correct, is that we should speak a common language. We should adopt a common language. This is true, but it's not quite as simple as that. One of the common answers to this question, or one of the common perceived solutions to this problem, is to say, well, if we just adopt the same common language, such as SysML, in the world of MBSE, then we can get rid of all this ambiguity and we can get rid of all this potential misunderstanding because we'll all be speaking the same language. This is a good idea in practice, but unfortunately in reality it's simply not the case. Adopting the use of a notation such as SysML is analogous to adopting a spoken language. So for example, if I were to say, let's all speak English on this project, we couldn't then assume that there'd be no more ambiguity, confusion, and misunderstanding ever again, because there's actually a certain level of ambiguity within that spoken language. Yes, like any good spoken language, English, Welsh, German, etc., each language will have its own syntax, semantics, and rules, and we do need these spoken languages as a basic communication mechanism. However, that's not the whole battle. The spoken language gives us, as we've said, the basic communication mechanism that's essential for everything that we do. Don't get me wrong, we're by no means demeaning the use of a common spoken language. This is absolutely crucial. But we need to understand that there are limitations on it. The spoken language will give us the basic mechanism that we need. It will allow us to communicate on a basic level. It will allow us to adopt the same basic terminology that we can use to communicate with one another. However, the problem comes in is when we speak to people with different backgrounds, in different organisations, with different experiences, essentially people. Even when we adopt the same spoken language, different people will have their own domain-specific language. Let's look at some examples of this. When we talk about a domain-specific language, we're assuming that we have some sort of underlying spoken language in place that will allow us to communicate. However, what you'll find is that people will attribute different meanings to the same words. Let's look at some examples of this. Let's take the word system. What exactly do we mean by a system? What makes up a system? Is it a subsystem? In turn, what makes up a subsystem? Could it be an assembly? What makes an assembly? Could it be a component? The truth is that all these terms are valid where appropriate, but they're not valid for every single person, even when using the same spoken language, in our case English. Different people with different backgrounds will attribute different meanings to things. There's a simple exercise that we can do here. Think about the word function. Do you understand what the word function means? Get together a group of people, let's say 5 people, and ask each of them if they understand the word function. Everybody will undoubtedly say yes. Ask each of them to write down the definition of the word function, and you will end up with at least 5 different definitions of what that term means. When we talk about a domain-specific language, what we're talking about is attributing specific meaning to specific terms that are suitable for the domain that we're working in, whether that's the discipline, whether it's the organisation we're working in, whether it's the group within the organisation that we're working on. When we talk about this domain-specific language, the way that we refer to this in the world of MBSE is by using the term an ontology. An ontology defines our domain-specific language. It's possible for different ontologies to exist within the same organisation. Certainly, different organisations will have different ontologies, and it's important to identify and define what these ontologies are. In the world of model-based systems engineering, the ontology is the main driver behind everything that we do. In the sense of speaking a common language, an ontology will help us identify the terminology and define what each one of these terms mean. Also, very importantly, it will help us identify relationships between these different ontological terms or these different concepts. This is crucial because it allows us to do things like traceability throughout our entire system. If you do your MBSE correctly and you have an ontology in place, then traceability comes for free. Some of the other benefits of the ontology include it's the driving force behind our framework. It's the mechanism that will allow us to ensure consistency across all the views that we produce that are based on the viewpoints within the framework. But that's the topic for another discussion. The ontology will also give us the basis for implementation using a tool. So if we want to generate things like profiles, it'll give us the basis for defining our profiles. When we get into some more advanced topics such as competencies, process modeling and so on, we'll also see how the ontology can help us to drive those different areas. So the ontology is an incredibly powerful thing to be able to produce. So let's have a quick look at one. Here we can see an example based on a needs ontology. This needs ontology, comes from the ACRE approach, the approach for context-based requirements engineering. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail on exactly what each of these terms means. That will be the subject of another video. However, let's have a look at the diagram and let's see what we can pick up with this. Notice that each of the blocks on this diagram, each of the rectangles on this diagram, is stereotyped as an ontology element. The stereotype is the word that's in the chevrons inside the rectangle. This tells me what basic type of element it is. So in this case, we're saying each of these rectangles is representing a concept or an ontology element within our ontology. Let's look at the middle. Let's start there. Let's start with need. We can see there are different types of need. There are 4 different types of need. But we can also see that a need description describes a need. We can see that one or more need is elicited from a source element. And we can see that one or more use case describes the context of a need. What's important to realize here is not just that we've identified the different terms within each of the blocks, so each of the ontology elements, but also that we're relating them together. This is very important because it means we can now establish things like traceability. So if we look in the bottom right, we've got the idea of a scenario. How does a scenario relate to a source element? Well, a scenario validates a use case is related to a need, and the need is elicited in the source element. So we can see these traceability paths come up. Also, behind each of the rectangles, we'll have a description of the ontology elements. We'll have a text-based description that gives us a bit more detail. Notice that when we write these descriptions, wherever possible, we use terminology taken from the ontology. This enforces our consistency of terminology across everything that we do. Also notice that in this diagram, we're actually using SysML to define the ontology. We're using the spoken language to define the domain-specific language. This is an important and powerful idea to get across because, as we said earlier, the spoken language, in this case SysML, gives us the basic mechanism that we need to communicate. What we're trying to communicate here is the domain-specific language, and that's why we're using SysML to define our ontology. So, in summary, therefore, how do we solve the problem of having communication issues? The simple answer is we adopt a common language. When we talk about adopting a common language, we need to bear in mind there are 2 aspects to this, the spoken language and the domain-specific language. The spoken language gives us the basic communication mechanism that's essential to allow us to talk to one another. In the case of MBSE, this might be a notation such as SysML. The domain-specific language, on the other hand, allows me to identify the specific terminology that I'm using and define the terms behind it. This we refer to as the ontology in the world of MBSE, and the ontology is one of the single most essential and powerful concepts that we have in MBSE. So, speaking a common language, it's not just as simple as saying let's adopt SysML, let's adopt English, for example. There's more to it than that. There's the two dimensions, the spoken language and the domain-specific language.